So in any event, I guess that what we'd like to do is I'm going to ask a few questions of the panelists. We'll go back and forth. You should feel free to use the chat window to ask questions, and we'll bounce them back and see where it goes from there. So anyway, why don't we start with Sean with a really sort of basic general question that comes up quite a bit. What is OSS? That is, as the term has grown over recent years, so is the ambiguity. Can you frame a concise working definition and indicate where there might be some confusion over what OSS is?
So yeah. Am I coming through clearly?
Yep, I could hear you.
Okay, so the term open source, it was originally coined by Christine Peterson back in 1998 and has been stewarded ever since by the Open Source Initiative. Open source is formally defined by 10 relatively straightforward criteria known as the source definition that actually leave very little room for ambiguity in my mind. It said a concise working synopsis that I would come up with would probably be that open source software is an approach to development and a legal framework for ensuring software can be used, studied, changed, distributed to anyone for any purpose. And if anything, the enduring success of the open source that was stewarded by the Open Source Initiative is a testament to that clarity and applicability and its utility. And I think it's that last part, to anyone for any purpose, that's been really disruptive. There are entire markets and business strategies and legal implements aimed at controlling who has access and what can and can't be done with software. And some of the open source definition criteria really fly in the face of that. I think open source has become a disruptive force, particularly to businesses where to anyone for any purpose is just not their cup of tea. You know, some have been just desperately trying to get new licenses accepted whose purpose seems to be to get around the open source definition's anti-discrimination criteria. And for example, businesses and governments that might want to claim they're open source, but not actually allow redistribution, for example. It's a pretty common one, but that's simply not open source, but they'd love for you to think that it was. And I think what's happening is open source has become, a truly valued commodity. Even as a branding, it's a proven development and business strategy. And I think the situation we're seeing today is what I would refer to as like an exploitation of the commons. Open source has penetrated into so many facets of our digital world because it's become nearly impossible to have a viable large-scale development strategy without leveraging open source in some manner.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to just sort of chime in or add or have a different opinion on that?
So I mean, I think that's a pretty good description of sort of like open source. I know one topic we'll probably want to dive a little deeper is that where open source sort of is. I mean, I think it's interesting. We still talk about open source as if it's a separate thing. It's a separate part of development, and I think we're just on this track of it will be basically the method that we do development, because almost all new software built today is based upon open source. So we still describe it as like a separate definition, like, oh, it's this thing over here. But in the reality, it's almost everything we use, or at least on a foundation level, it's everything we use. And that distinction between, well, what is open source and what is not? Like if you base something upon open source, but you build something proprietary, is that still open source? And I think that's the distinction that we're running into, is we're still doing a lot of that. So we use open source to build everything, and we use open to build closed, which is a very fascinating thing.
I think the dialogue has become much more sophisticated. I mean, I do remember, back at the State University of New York about 10, 12 years ago, there was a dialogue ad nauseum over what is OSS, how is it defined, and the like, and the sort of resistance to accept it. Then I know that there's been phases of different types of use of the term, or people using the term for different purposes. And I'm sure that we're going to get back to this as part of the theme of our discussion. I would like to direct, though, another question to Georg. We all know that the dialogue about OS has become loud and pervasive. Where in your day-to-day life do you find OSS? That is, how does it impact us on a daily basis?
So if I just think through my day-to-day and where I touch open source, it starts even before I get out of bed with my sleep tracker. I probably run some open source on it. My toothbrush, it's an electric toothbrush with some settings, probably runs open source software somewhere inside as well. When I get up, go to meetings, open up my laptop, go to work, the browser technology, all big browsers, Chrome, Firefox, Edge, Safari, they all built on open source. The entire web is built on open source modules and libraries for JavaScript, and libraries like jQuery or Angular, and the technology that we use to connect the internet itself goes through routers and ISPs that all use open source to power the internet and connect it. So throughout my day-to-day life, I use it all the time, even when I'm not thinking about technology. So when I go to the store, I get in my car, I just want to drive, but there is open source running under the hood, running the infotainment system, and even the operations of the car. There is open source in the infrastructure that I use, in the roads, the stop signs, the signals, the signs that are developed in open source. Even if I don't use my car, if I go by public transportation system, there's open source powering the data format for how I can see what times the next bus leaves on my app, and to be able to communicate between the providers and the different apps that they have developed through open source methods, these standards. So it's really everywhere, and that's just in my day-to-day life. If we look at other industries, there are machineries and tools that all somehow incorporate open source without even noticing it.
Yeah, so I think that we all are probably, I mean, I think everyone probably on this call who's involved in OSS at different levels and are involved in different aspects of it will know particular, will be quite familiar with particular applications and particular bits of infrastructure and the like. And it sounds as if OSS is pretty ubiquitous. Particularly when considering its relationship to infrastructure and those things that we don't see often as consumers. We might see them more as technicians. What does this mean, though, for, if it's sitting underneath all of these things that we use and the general infrastructure for how we get stuff done? What does this mean for the individuals and organizations that rely on it? That is, like, for governments or corporations that depend on OSS. So, what does this mean as it becomes more well-known and appreciated? And how are those sorts of organizations reacting? And Georg, you might have some thoughts. Jacob, you might have some thoughts about that. What's the appropriate? Yeah, I mean, how do we manage this?
Yeah. Gary, do you want to go first, or I can talk at length at this?
Well, so there is everyone who is making these pieces that we rely on for the infrastructure has to. It's not the open source that they are selling necessarily. Open source is empowering them to build these tools and infrastructure. And instead of reinventing the wheel, they can work with even competitors on solving shared problems. We see this in various industries where with cars, for example, the infotainment system, that's just something that we all have come to expect in a car. And yes, it looks and feels a little bit different, but the basic functions are always the same. So the car manufacturers, why should they develop their own system that connects to Bluetooth, that connects to your phone? And coming together and having something like auto grade Linux, where it's a project that car makers can collaborate on these core functions that don't differentiate between the cars, just makes a lot of sense. So there are many examples like this that we can talk about how every company can somehow benefit from using open source in their innovation stream. But Jacob, you have probably a lot more examples because you do work with these companies.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the vehicle example really highlights things because auto grade Linux is it's becoming very ubiquitous. Like I recently purchased a new to me car, like a 2018 Subaru. And if I go to the infotainment system and I look at it, there's a little area for licenses, and I can read the GPL on my infotainment system in my car. But you could do that with a Mercedes, a BMW, a Ford. I mean, the GPL code, the open source code, is not just running like the infotainment system; it's running the engine itself, which then brings in a whole lot of other questions in terms of where open source is being used. As in the automotive industry, and this is not just the automotive industry. This is in the construction industry as well. Obviously, like hospitality, in the IoT industry, and now it's finally making its way all the way through to the electrical outlets in your house, the light bulbs, the LED. Like it's that ubiquitous that open source code is everywhere. So the question then becomes, 20, 30 years ago, you had a company and you hired developers and you built something that was just yours. It was very easy. Developer works for me, therefore code is fine, done. Now you're building products and it's across industry that are not yours to begin with. They are commons. The code that you start with is not 100% yours. So your developers that you bring on to your project, whatever it is, are now collaborating externally by default from day one. And not a lot of companies are really set up for that. We asked about the federal side, and we were just having this conversation in the class on Monday, actually, where Sean's like, yeah, I remember this one, where you could be a federal employee, and we have this really wonderful conversation in the U.S. and in European countries, and Asian countries have already actually done a lot of this. But the conversation is, if we're going to spend taxpayer money to build software code, then the software code should be free and open to the public. Public money, public code. And that's been going on for over a decade and has been codified into law in various countries. But if you're a federal employee, your employment contract does not allow you to work on open source code. So the law says, and the US law is already there, we must consider open source code first for new projects, and for certain agencies, you must develop a percentage of your code as open source. But your employment contract has not caught up. So if you're an employee, you cannot work on open source code. We have these examples all over the place, and they're just sort of like very, very odd. So as at Accenture, we can respond to one and we can say, yeah, we'll work on it in open source. And then we do it as an outside agency, but the employee who works for the agency sometimes cannot work on that same project because it's open source and their employment contract says everything must be siloed. So we're still working through a lot of this. And part of it is because open source has become so ubiquitous that the default is you're starting from an open and must collaborate standpoint. But the default of like employment contracts and how we work and our business models are not that way. And that's our current conflict, but it's shifting.
Yeah, so I'm thinking this through, and I do think, and I think your point's really well taken in regard to sort of policy and contracts and the like, maybe not being aligned. I was back around 3-4 months ago, maybe it was longer than that, may have been about a year ago. I was reviewing a Ford Foundation grant or proposal for grants that was responding to concerns about sustainability. So not necessarily initial development, but sustainability of core software that that the DoD depends on, or that various aspects of the government depends on, and it relates to the public good. And we know that, I mean, for instance, in New Zealand, their national voting system and their national betting system are both open source applications, both of which are, the integrity of those systems are critical. How do we make certain that how do we, as I guess, people interested in the public good, and in the government, people responsible for the public good, how do we ensure that, or help support the sustainability of these projects and software and elements that aren't necessarily even developed in-house? Is there any thoughts on that?
That's a conversation that has been going on for quite a while, because as we rely on open source in our everyday today lives for all kinds of things, it is becoming more and more important that we avoid vulnerabilities. And there are some examples that really have highlighted in the recent years how if we all rely on the same software and there's some problem in it, suddenly everyone has that problem. A big example that was in all major news outlets was 6 years ago with Heartbleed, where a small software library, the OpenSSL software library that is used to encrypt data connections, was used by almost every web server. And whenever we would connect to any web server on the internet, we probably were using it. And it had a flaw in it that every web server then inherited that could expose sensitive information. And that really highlighted this issue that, hey, we need to take care of this open source software that is our infrastructure, the digital infrastructure. Another example that shows that we need to actually pay attention to what is happening in open source projects was the data breach that Equifax experienced 3 years ago, where hundreds of millions of consumer data, personal data, social security numbers in the US have been exposed to the internet because Equifax was building on the Apache Struts open source project and didn't update it when there was an update. They were using an old and outdated version, even though there was a known vulnerability, and they just hadn't paid attention to it. And so this conversation is right now, how do we understand how secure is a software project? What's the risk with using it? How are we being alerted that there is something going on that we need to pay attention to? And so that is something we need to work on the technology side, but then also on the social side. How do we ensure that as technology advances, we can continue to update and upgrade the software and have communities that take care of it? And there are many solutions that have been proposed. One that I think will have to be part of it is that companies are dedicating some of their resources back into open source and are helping to maintain the projects that they rely on. Only together can we achieve this. So,
and I have a viewpoint on this that sort of like goes on with what Gary was talking about. That I think the time has come in our industry where we've done a number of things, and this is going to be a very difficult problem to solve, and it's not going to be one solution. There's going to be lots and lots of solutions that have to be implemented. But how do we make open source sustainable? I think, partially we need to have, split time. So some developers need time on their work time to be able to contribute back. Companies need to recognize this. We have foundations that were built. I mean, I've spent a lot of my career trying to help, financially sustain the Drupal project with our board and our community. And one thing that I look towards is I look to how do other industries do this, and so there's there's a few different models that I like to look at. One is the fishing industry. How did fishing become sustainable to prevent overfishing and the like? The other is B Corps, and the third is electricians. Um, uh, One of the issues with the electric industry, like early on when it was sort of becoming, is they had all these people who were like, I'm an electrician, and they were coming in and they were just building all sorts of random things and putting wires everywhere and electrocuting themselves and harming people. I mean, this was a real thing that was going on when we were electrifying the country. And if we think we're rebuilding how we build software, we're redoing infrastructure across in a very similar scale, if not larger, than the electrification of communities and cities. And so one of the things that I look to is businesses need to be certified as being able to work on open source, and businesses that hire need to only hire those who are certified. Just like you wouldn't hire an unlicensed electrician or somebody who hasn't gone to school, I think businesses are going to move hopefully soon to not hire just developers. They're going to be open source minded developers. And those companies that would get that certification, similar to like the fishing industry, would be audited to say, like, are they actually sustaining the project? Do they understand the whole stack? Are they part of these things? So that we don't run into things like companies that implemented OpenSSL, and walked away without recognizing that the problem with OpenSSL is not that it was like bad. They were operating on less than $50,000 a year to secure billions of transactions. And the problem in my eyes is there was companies, very large, multi-million dollar, multi-billion dollar companies implementing OpenSSL that were turning a blind eye and not even looking. And they shouldn't be allowed to continue to operate like that. So just like what we did with the electric companies, we would not certify those companies that aren't looking at the whole stack. And people should not hire those companies, and those companies would be certified that are looking at the whole stack, and they would get, preference in the economy. So I think we're in that midst of that transition, because when we talk about regulations and things of that nature, would we want to hire just a random developer to work on our car? Because our car is now based upon open source. It is the thing that controls the engine. It controls the braking. It controls, torque and things like that, and traction control in snowy conditions. That is open source. You're not going to hire a random developer there. You're going to hire somebody certified. The problem is there is no certification that exists. You're still going off of your own research. But we do have that certification in fishing and in manufacturing and in electric companies. And I think we're going to eventually move towards that. I just don't know if we know what it is yet, but I think that's how we're going to get to real, true, long-term sustainability. But in the meantime, we have a lot of great ideas that are happening right now that need to be, promoted and moved.
Wow, Jacob. I'm getting I think that's a really interesting direction that you've taken there. And I'd like to get some additional thoughts. But do we lose anything by sort of looking at regulating or qualifying in the way that you're suggesting? Do we lose anything from sort of the openness culture? I'm going to just throw it out like that.
I mean, if we look at it in terms of the B Corp, I don't think we lose much. In fact, I think we gain a lot of innovation, because if we think of it like the electric company, we think heavy regulation and that. But if you look at it in terms of fair trade certifications or B Corp, it's a little bit more open, and people trying to make a better world and readjusting or redoing the rules of the land as they've been laid out. And I think we're more towards that. So one of the things that I'd love to actually see is, open source companies, open source sustainability could be part of the B Corp certification process. And then you look towards hiring a B Corp, because you know that they're looking at the full stack, they're being holistic, they're looking at the sustainability of not just their company, but the community that they're in and the area that they're in, which also includes open source. It's not currently one of their things, but that would be one direction I would look at. So it doesn't need to be like a federal regulation, just something our industry takes on.
I think it's an excellent point, especially that how this pertains to governments. That there's a culture shift that's needed, and a lot of the resistance. I mean, if you think about the federal government, for at least in the United States, they're one of the largest producers of of software on the planet, but they're one of the smallest players in open source currently. And I think a lot of that has to do with these questions of sustainability, of fear, uncertainty, of doubt. And for the government to get involved, they want assurances, and having some sort of standardization, having policies in place that everyone can understand and agree to beforehand. I think it is one of the things that will help those niches of communities that want more assurance, that want more stability before they venture into the world of open source. And that's an important aspect. I know for governments in particular, that like one of the biggest challenges is one of bidirectional information sharing. If you think about your typical interaction with the government, like say you're at jury duty, the public doesn't traditionally get a say in like what processes are used or what software is used and how's that software, how good is that software. That was done through government developers, through contracting, through other mechanisms where everything is lined up in advance. There's requirements that are fulfilled and testable. And that's not a typical open source development model. It's not that culture, that mindset is highly disrupted by open source. Yet there are obvious benefits of being able to have public engagement and public trust and community building, where you can trust your government and how they're operating and have a say in actually how to improve government. I think this is going to lead to a lot of interesting advancements as open source is able to provide this framework of trust.
And I like the analogy that Jacob brought of using the electrical industry with open source, where in open source, we have left, or we are leaving the Wild West behind, where everyone did what they wanted. There were no standards. We have seen quite a bit of standardization in how open source works these days. At the beginning, everyone used different version control systems. Now everyone uses Git. There were different ways of coordinating through mailing lists, through this and that. Now we have mostly, GitHub is very big, and then we have the Atlassian stack, we have GitLab. And with all those, you have most of the projects already covered. And then when it comes to governance on open source projects, there is a standardization happening right now. The Linux Foundation, the Apache Software Foundation, the Eclipse Foundation, they're all doing amazing work at building out governance models that we have come to trust and rely on, so that when we move from one project to another, we can start to see the same elements again and again. We can just start to dive into the code. And so I think we are in this process right now. But the nice thing is, and this is why I like this analogy with the electrical industry, is if you are a tinkerer and you just want to do your own thing in the basement, you can still buy those electrical parts and build your own 3D printer from scratch if you want to. And you'll be able to do the same thing with open source software. But if you want to take the next step, if you have a great innovation, like you built a cool new electrical tool, whatever, you can find people who are certified, who can make it professional and start up your own business and make a professional offering. And open source allows you to do that as well.
I'd like to kind of follow, it's changing gears a little bit, but follow along sort of in that general, I guess, something that I think is related. And, that's, our most of the world's economy runs on sort of an incentive program around, profit. And so how does an organization, an individual, a company actually sort of generate value that translates into financial sustainability, profit for that organization from OSS? That is, how do we ensure that there's a system in place that incentivizes the creation and continued improvement of open source technologies?
Oh, I can talk about that.
Go for it, Jacob.
I mean, this is a lot of what I do is focus on this. I think to Georg's point, like we've moved beyond the Wild West. There is, and I'll continue with the Wild West. And there's money in them hills. Like the money's out there. It's a very big. This is a multi-trillion-dollar industry in open source, and the money is it's almost some in some cases like easily had. So one way, if you're a consulting agency or such, and you said, hey, you built, for example, with Equifax, hey, you built all of your infrastructure on open source, which almost everybody has, but you keep hiring all these people that just have no idea what open source is. I do, and my company does, and here's our plan, and here's our strategy for doing that, and to making sure you're safe and you're secure. Like you get paid a premium to do that because they don't want to go through another breach like that, which was a very simple breach. And all you need to do is hire developers that were just more focused on the stack, which most truly open source developers are. They look at their entire stack, but most traditional developers have just sort of like, have never heard of open source and just go straight. They're only focused on the layer that they work on. So I think there's market differentiations that we can do today that get out there. I would like those to be reinforced by the overall open source community to move the markets completely so that the buyers of open source or the buyers of software are looking towards open source developers first as the various, not just sort of like developers. That's going to be, I think that's where the market is. So in short, the money's there, but we're not directing it to the right places. We're still allowing it to be directed to non-open source developers in mass. And I think that can be, changed. And I mean, as a case in point, just, the type of work I do, like if you hired me or my team from Accenture to come out and help, we're not cheap. We're not cheap at all, but we're good. And we help you with the open source, and people are hiring us to do this. Like there's no shortage of work out there. So, which is very different than I would say 15 years ago, which is everybody's like, well, why would I hire it? It's free software. I'm not going to use that. Like you would get paid much more as a Microsoft developer and proprietary than you would as an open source developer. And now I think, ironically, you could probably get paid more as a Microsoft open source developer today than a closed source developer, since Microsoft is pretty heavily in open source these days. But yeah, it's there. It's just not quick and easy to get to because there's no obvious marketing route to it right now. There's still a lot of education that has to happen. I mean, I think Equifax is case in point. It was a very simple, easy fix, a very, very easy fix. It's just who they were hiring were not focused on it. They was like, oh, it's open source. I don't need to worry about that. I just use the tool. And it's like, that's not acceptable anymore. It's like the electricians. It's not acceptable. Oh, I just ran wires. It was fine. I didn't care. I didn't look at the gauge of the wire. It's a wire. It requires electricity. Like, no, there's more science to it. And it's the same with open source. There's a whole stack, and it's getting more complex. It's getting much more complex, and it's not going to get easier. Like if your developers are not focused on the whole stack, yeah. So I want to fix that marketing. I think if we did, we would solve this sort of like market where the money is problem.
I think you said a very key word there that resonated with me there, Jacob. Education. If you think about how a lot of companies out there, this is new to a lot of domains. And I think education is a large component of how a company can figure out how to learn about how to make money off of open source, whether that's consulting with companies and reaching out to others, or whether it's taking classes, tongue-in-cheek plug for the Brandeis courses, to send leadership and send their developers to learn about what it means to be an open source developer, what that culture looks like and how to leverage it. The more that people become aware of that, the more that education is sort of spreads throughout a workforce, that corporate culture can shift, and there can be support and policies and structures, and that all this can come together to where they can find ways to make this part of their business strategy to, accelerate their acquisitions, to, develop software and come to market faster.
I've in my research, I've talked to a lot of open source developers, companies, organizations, about how they are making money. And what I find interesting is, as Jacob said, there is money. It's not always easy to get to. And I've talked to people who have pivoted like 10, 15 times, trying different strategies to make money from their open source work. And there are examples of trying to include advertisement in the software, trying to sell consultancy, but then not having time to focus on building the software, or selling custom developments, but then losing the overall strategy of the project because now they're chasing the dollars on customizations, on building out a SaaS platform. There are so many different ways that you can use an open source software. Now, the question is, who are we talking about? Who's making money? Are we talking about the developer working on the software to make money? Or are we talking about companies that rely on open source to make money because they get faster innovation, they can drive down cost for developing software, they can have better access to talent pool to hire from. These are all benefits that are not necessarily reflected in their financial statements, but are real value propositions for why we want to work in and with open source. Those are just some examples that easily come to mind.
Yeah, and I'll clarify something too. Like, I think Gayer's like hitting right on it, and Sean about the education is that, I feel very strongly the money is there, but we are not directing it to the right people. So right now, there is probably right at this very minute, there's some company in the world that is hiring for $1 million project to be built on their software, and that software is most likely going to be on open source. So $1 million is being spent on a new piece of software, and it's based on open source. Now, how much of that $1 million went to the developers of the open source project that the new software is built on is probably next to nothing. And that's the issue. So the money's there. It's just going to these companies that are just completely ignoring the foundation, and we have to solve that problem. I think it's one of the many problems that we have to solve. So like companies like Open Collective are getting there, and the Back Your Stack initiatives, and many more. I'm blanking on the other one right now, but it'll come up.
There's another one that's attempting it.
Yeah, and these are great initiatives that need to be done, but the people who have the $1 million check to be written for open source are not directing it to the open source developers right now, and that's the big problem. So I think we can solve it, but it's going to take a while.
So I don't know if this is a sort of a naive question or direction. So is the idea, I mean, I've heard it expressed that certainly open technology development, but also more broadly, the sort of more openness, open access, open education, open this, open that, open data standards, whatever the case may be, sort of flips the economics of a constraint-based economy or model for generating profit. So you basically artificially create demand through restricting access, and then you charge people for access. Whereas open source and other principles of openness sort of eliminates that as your fundamental economic model, at least for the intellectual property. Are we simply moving that constraint to the expertise of individuals who act as consultants or developers or whatever the case may be? And if we are, then is the problem, Jacob, that you're describing, that we just haven't gotten down how the value should flow to the foundation, the developers, the whatever the case may be?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the problem. How to solve that, I think I think honestly solving it is largely very, very education based. but that takes a very, very long time. I think companies like Red Hat are doing a great job, and I would even say Microsoft is starting to do a pretty good job, because they're providers of some sort of service or product. The people who are writing checks are coming to them for advice. And so Red Hat often says, well, the people you want to hire are these people, those people, and those people. Effectively just sort of like certifying like people that they know are companies that are also backing their stack and helping the open source community as a whole, either by hiring them full time and having them as full time developers, or financially supporting them in some way. But they're pointing to companies that actually understand the full stack of software that's employed, and not just like, oh, I'm only going to focus on the level. But we need more of those, a lot more of those.
Well, I appreciate it. We're sort of running down on time, and I'd like to provide the opportunity, if anyone, I know everyone's been really sort of quiet. If seeing as we're here on Zoom, we probably don't need to ask questions using chat if you don't want to. If anyone has anything they'd like to contribute, or just feel free. If any of the participants or anyone else has anything to add. Ultan?
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, I'm a colleague of Sylvia's, just to let you know. Last week, I attended a webinar organized in Europe on promoting open source in general. And one of the questions which came repeatedly back was about how to attract new companies, especially startups, into the open source community. In particular, it revolved around the whole monetization side of things, because basically the issue is, you may know from Sylvia, we're in a standards body, and we've fundamentally a similar issue as well, that funders, not founders, funders of startups, VCs and whatnot, they see value in developing and capturing IP. And they can't get their heads around this idea of giving it away, in whether it's an open source project or whether it's in the standardization community, where, okay, it's not necessarily given away, but certainly you're working with others to create a greater value, a networked innovation type of scenario, and they can't get their heads around this. Do you have any experience of that? Have you come across venture capital companies who understand the open source space, or is it really an uphill struggle?
I can keep going. I mean, I think certainly yes. There are VCs that know this. Y Combinator is pretty famous for sort of like understanding open source, and they're not perfect, but they do recognize that a lot of the companies that are built upon open source software, and so there needs to be some sort of like sustainability there. And again, I'm not saying they're perfect, but in terms of VC companies, they're not ignoring it, and they're trying to find the issue. A big issue of this is it's the arbitrage, the arbitrage opportunities that are out there. If you base your company off of open source and are going to sustain it, and you're saying, well, I'm going to sell the product for $100, and 20% of that is going to go to sustaining open source software development, well, a competitor can come right along and sell the same product for $80 and just not support. It's a very simple and happens all the time. So until we kill that arbitrage opportunity across the economy, like, it's going to keep happening. But what you do is you find one ways we're currently doing it is with like TideLift and Open Collective, which I keep mentioning, and focusing on different parts of the value chain. So a lot of Y Combinator ones are not focused on the software that's built, but the community or the clientele or the customer base. And they focus on that through like rapid, sort of like basically rapid releases, like going so fast that your competitors can't catch up. And we see this with like Snapchat, Instagram, and TikTok happening right now, where somebody builds the software first and then the others copy it. But they knew that was going to happen, so they just released something else new and keeps their competitors behind. Like TikTok's pretty famous for this. But we also see that with like more boring stuff. Like Expensify is really good at this. Expensify is pretty decent in terms of open source collaboration and supporting the ecosystem. but they keep iterating and building a better expense application. So Expensify does like your receipt reimbursements for a company. They make that really simple, and they just keep innovating. They keep moving forward. So the value is not the software, because they know that that could be replicated. The value is what it brings to the customer, and they're very, very focused on like keeping that customer like coming back because there's new features. So that's where they're making their money, and they know that their software is basically going to be replicated, which is the open source model. We don't care. We don't want it to be replicated, but we got to focus on a different value. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's sort of like value question. You got to focus on a different area of value, and there are VCs very focused on that. But this arbitrage is incredibly difficult to overcome. Very, very difficult. You need marketing, really, because to start up a no company where you're in that competitive landscape and you don't have a body that's going to like point to you and say you're the right person to hire to all of the potential customers, you're always going to have a low cost provider that's going to just eat your lunch. Did that get to your?
Yeah, I
Okay,
guess so. I mean, it's there's no easy answer yet.
Not. I don't think there's an easy answer yet. Not yet.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, there's other
agree,
techniques
there's
like
definitely not an
focusing
easy
on
answer.
open core and things. Yeah. Sorry. But
Yeah, I've got a question. Jacob probably knows this is coming. Is if you have a company that builds private IP, but is big, but the entire stack, very much like Equifax, is based on open source. How do you sell to CEOs and CFOs as the CTO that that's a good investment for them to give to Open Collective and Tidelift, et cetera, the stacks, as you said, support your stack, when they only look at bottom line and they look at it as it's free, why should I pay for it?
I mean, my quick elevator pitch was, I think that's why we need industry certification, because we're going to constantly have this back and forth and this conversation. But I think the two that I use quite often are: do you want to be involved with Heartbleed or the Equifax breach? Because both of those were hiring inadequate developers and not looking at your stack. So this is why you invest, and if you don't, you're just putting yourself at risk for those two things that are very public. And I constantly just bring that up. I'm like, it's a very, like, that's all it is. It's risk mitigation. You're not paying to do something else. You're risk mitigating, because if you support your software, just like you would pay a license to Microsoft, then you're risk mitigating. And I try to change that, because of 10 years ago, we would always say, well, you have to save money because it's free. You're saving money because you're not buying a license. And I know a long time ago, I started saying that, like, you're not going to save any money. You're going to be highly innovative and you're going to be on the cutting edge. But what you're doing is shifting your funds from the license to support. And support is a risk mitigation. So not only are you going to be more innovative, you're going to have less risk. So those are the two things that you get, versus I'm going to save money by license, which 100% I used to do 10, 15 years ago. Like, this is free, this is free, this is free. And now the message is, yeah, you get it for free, but it's not free. It's free as in freedom, not as in beer. Like, you're going to spend that money, but you're getting innovation and risk mitigation. So I try to use that messaging.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Look, I know that we're right at 1 o'clock. And I'd be happy to stay on, but I know that everyone's pretty busy. If anyone has one more question that they'd like to throw out there or comment, that'd be great. That was a pretty compelling dialogue. I enjoyed that. Anything else? Okay, we're going to assume that silence is assent. Okay, well, I really, really appreciate it. And I want to give one more, I don't know if I said it enough at the beginning, but I do want to thank Brandeis University, and I do want to thank the Open Source Initiative for being, a real partner in this. And in the program and in doing the types of things that we're doing. And thank you, panelists, and really thank you everyone who showed up and stayed with us and asked questions and smiled a little bit. Thank you very much.